Recently, Marxist YouTuber Hakim made a video quote-unquote debunking the economic calculation problem. Now, frankly, this video was extremely disappointing. It came off as very, very bad faith, as if he just Googled economic calculation problem debunk and posted whatever he could possibly find, even if the arguments were contradictory or already had thorough responses put forward by Austrians. He even cited David McMullen's Medium article, which had a huge misunderstanding of what the economic calculation problem even was and has already been responded to by people like Austro-Mutualist. But Hakim practically acts like there's never been any responses to any of these arguments. He briefly mentions a Cato article, which was probably the worst defense he could possibly find, and he didn't even do a good job refuting it. But anyways, now we're just going to jump right into his video.
Here's a highly requested video, the so-called economic calculation problem. Now, this is something that really is a non-issue, and most people that invoke the ECP know very little of the details of the nearly century-long now discussion revolving around it.
And this is really ironic because Hakim clearly does not understand the socialist calculation debate. He only gives one side of the story. For actual reading on this, I highly suggest From Marx to Mises by David Ramsey Steele.
The basic overview was given by von Mises and built upon further by Hayek. The argument goes as follows. Rational economic decision-making is not possible without price signals provided by genuinely competitive markets based on private ownership of the means of production and investment on the basis of profit maximization.
Before discussing this subject, to prevent any confusion, we will define our first principles, those being economic calculation, the economic calculation problem, the presuppositions that the calculation problem makes, including why the ECP applies to socialism. Let's begin with economic calculation, which simply put is an aggregate of inputs and outputs through a homogeneous variable, i.e. price, with the purpose of evaluating a particular course of action. A homogeneous variable must allow us to compare the cost of all factors of production across all sectors. It provides us with a common denominator to compare heterogeneous factors A, B, and C whilst only using variable z, therefore allowing us to commensurate the factors of production. This is a basic homogeneous variable, however a simple variable alone does not suffice. This is the segue into rationality. As for z to be able to accurately determine productive efficiency, it must be rational, as if not, we cannot accurately represent the value of different factors of production, making it difficult to weigh inputs versus outputs. For variable z to be rational in the first place, it must assume full knowledge of consumer demand, in terms of the rate of competition not holding demand, and supply, in terms of units produced, and also units reserved for productive use. To prevent further misunderstanding of the ECP, I will clarify that I am speaking of the market for capital goods when I am talking about the pricing mechanism. Even Mises, the creator of the economic calculation problem, believed that we could sufficiently price consumption goods under socialism, although Hayek believed otherwise. Moving on to the economic calculation problem, if we understand that variable z becomes rational due to its assuming a full knowledge of supply and consumer demand, we could then know that we cannot determine rational prices for capital goods if there is no market for capital goods, since this knowledge is a derivative of markets. Internal transfers do not suffice in terms of rationality, like markets, because capital goods forgo their status of objects of exchange when they are internally transferred. If planners are setting prices for their good within a socialist economy, they are not pricing them based upon the willingness of others to purchase them, or to reach the market clearing price to maximize profits, but based on an arbitrary appraisal, which could not be rational. With the use of internal transfers, an economy is unable to establish the requisite exchange ratios for economic calculation. Simply put, the calculation problem posits that without market prices, there is an impossibility of rational economic calculation. This is posed as a critique of socialism, due to the obvious fact that they are opposed to markets, and a derivative of that is in fact they are opposed to a proper pricing system. Something necessary to understanding the ECP is the presupposition it makes in regards to what it generously grants to socialists. These are: 1, it assumes that we have full knowledge of consumer demand; 2, it assumes that we have full knowledge of all the technological recipes in regards to producing consumer goods; 3, it assumes we have the full knowledge of all the relevant quantities and qualities of all the different factors of production, both original and produced; 4, it assumes away the potentially bad incentives of the central planners and assumes that the incentive problem in general is not an issue. 5, it assumes we would have complete agreement on what exact course of action to take regarding what needs to be produced. Now, if a railway company is in the hands of a private entrepreneur, he has every incentive to choose the method of construction with the lowest monetary cost, assuming the same utility to the consumers, in order to achieve the highest degree of profit. However, this also serves society best. What does it mean if engineering is too expensive? It means that other participants in the markers, for example farmers, are willing to pay engineers more. The The reason for this is most probably that the farmers' consumers, producers of foodstuffs, are willing to pay them more for their crops. These producers of lower order goods, in turn, are willing to pay more, because their own consumers are willing to pay more for their final goods. In accordance to the marginalist theory of value, elaborated by the founders of the Austrian school such as Karl Menger, a change in consumer demand, at whatever stage of production it may occur, creates a signal for producers at higher stages that tells them which needs are to be satisfied more and which less urgently. A rise in the price of engineering means that the engineering is being used in the production process that are creating goods which the consumer urgently needs, and thus only producers satisfying even more urgent needs may acquire it. The price system, based on the maximization of profits and utility, seemingly coordinates economic participants without any planning. Yet planning as such not only does not disappear, but it is only possible in a free market environment. The Austrian thinkers, such as Hayek, were right in calling the price system a system of information sharing. The price system does nothing more than divide a kind of mental labor between several miniature planned economies. Mental labor that could not be carried out by a single, publicly owned planned economy. Its tool for this task is money. Money provides the common denominator which the socialist thinkers were unable to invent. It is the tool which enables market participants to use accounting methods to compare the incomes and costs of their activities, and to plan for the future steps accordingly.
As they rely on the flawed assumption that whatever is profitable is useful, increases general well-being, improves society, meets a need, and so on. Even with that said, only the smart ones will get far enough to admit this. To socialists, on the other hand, efficiency is measured according to need first. How many calories, how many housing units, how many roads or hospitals or schools, etc. Furthermore, the entire argument, and Mises' conception in particular, hinges on a world of horse-drawn carriages and a lack of instant communications. His arguments fall apart when we take into account satellites, the internet, and modern computing. By the 1940s, the theoretical responses to Mises, Hayek, and Co. in relation to the ECP solved this non-issue, especially in relation to consumer goods.
And this is the entire problem with socialists. They view production on a very basic level, such as how many hospitals do we need? But what about how many hospitals can we actually build? What materials will we use? Will using material A be better than using material B? If we use material A, what can we use material B for? Is material B more valuable than another sector? Is it better to break it up into two smaller hospitals in two different areas? There's still so much more going on here. You can't just break it down to one number. As for the computer argument, which has basically become a meme at this point, Lucas Engelhardt wrote a very informative paper on this. He points out the computation problem. Drawing from realities found in computational economics, even if all the data is given and production is ignored, the size of the computational problem makes large-scale central planning a practical impossibility. The size of the problem to be solved and limitations on computer processing power do not allow for computers to provide a solution to large-scale economic problems in a time that is useful. For example, even under severe simplifying assumptions, distributing 80,000 heterogeneous consumer goods among 6 billion heterogeneous consumers requires a calculation that would take at least 10.5 quintillion years.
By the 50s, Kantorovich proved that you can carry out rational economic planning and optimize production without money.
The issue with this is linear programming only works if we live in a static economy. But the economy we live in is an ever-changing disequilibrated economy. Even then, linear programming is simply a method in which we can maximize or minimize material costs and outputs. It completely misses the point of the ECP. The ECP deals with the question, how do we establish quantitative relationships between different factors of production, and by what common denominator can we do this? Linear programming does not do this. For example, linear programming could tell us how using so much more of X instead of Y would affect output. It cannot tell us whether or not we should use X or Y in a dynamic economy.
Supposedly, the market is the most efficient mechanism for the allocation of resources. If that really is the case, though, why have they done such a shit job of it all? Boom and bust cycles, the associated severe recessions that drown countless millions into poverty, destroying whole economies in the process, all of this happens due to mismatches between required inputs and produced outputs. I thought prices and market mechanisms were supposed to prevent such gross mismatches. If the market remains so efficient, why is it that when these disastrous failures happen, capitalism isn't saved by market mechanisms, but by government bailouts and pump priming?
Various claims are advanced here which reflect nothing more than a complete ignorance of economic principles. It is clear that Hakim has never once actually picked up a book that challenges his positions, or even made any attempt to challenge his own beliefs. In fact, it is very likely he is in the same boat as other Marxists, in that he develops his beliefs from buzzwords thrown around by his friends. I, for one, refuse to believe that Hakim has ever actually read anything based on the obscene stupidity of the comments made in this section. It is equivalent to a toddler trying to walk. They try so hard, yet fall every time. the utter absurdity of the position that markets fail to allocate, when the real reason is that when governments intervene in markets and central banks become intent on creating cheap money or erasing and contracting liquidity into the market, followed by a sharp contraction as what happened in the 1995 to 2003 recession, in reality, the reason market allocation has suffered in recent years is not due to markets themselves, but on the contrary, due to the fascist-inspired system of government that is closer to central planning than it is a market economy. Hakim claims that if markets were truly the most efficient system for the rational allocation of resources, why is it that markets are tending toward a less than optimal allocation? He brings up a main example, which represents his absolute incoherence towards how markets and cycles actually work, that being the boom and bust cycle. It is completely untrue that the boom and bust cycle is a naturally occurring phenomena, and further that it would be prevalent in a free banking regime. A business cycle can be described in the simple statement that it is a widespread entrepreneurial error in investment channeled into the structure of production. It is not true that there is a systematic collapse of spending, and it is also not true that there is a systematic overinvestment. Rather, there is a systematic malinvestment. Business cycles have almost always been started from central bank injections of liquidity or easy money or some variation of interference in the market. This is particularly true, as previously noted, the high-tech bubble in the 2000s and the financial crisis of 2008. There always seems to be an existing trend of high levels of interference in the market by the government. In the tech bubble, the Fed introduced a sharp spike of liquidity injections in order to avoid what they thought would be a coming economic downturn. However, by inducing such sharp liquidity, once the threat of these downturns had turned out to be not so prevalent, the Fed induced yet another sharp contraction of liquidity, which, surprise, surprise, caused a building asset bubble to collapse. In 2008, it asserted that deregulation of banks caused the crisis, and yet such nonsense could be dispelled by a toddler with an iPhone. The only deregulation at the time which may have had any impact whatsoever was the partial repeal of the Glass-Steagall Act. And yet, as an explanation for the holding of mortgage-backed securities as bank assets, this completely fails to explain this. What in fact does explain this is the capital requirements that, lo and behold, the government, and not markets, imposed on the holding of highly rated mortgage-backed securities. The capital requirements to hold these securities were significantly lower than holding other assets, and thus, of course, banks flocked to them. Once again, we see governments, not markets, are the problem. Boom and bust cycles, stock bubbles, etc., are caused by central bank injections of new money/liquidity and holding down of interest rates to spur higher investment. In a market economy, a free banking regime would stabilize the supply of money with the demand for inside money, and move that inversely to velocity, holding as close as possible to monetary equilibrium. Systematic malinvestment would not occur under a free market. Hakim then goes on to make the recurring theme of idiotic claims that if capitalism was so efficient, why was it saved by bailouts and such but not capitalism? This once again merely shows that he is a moron who doesn't understand what he's talking about. Government bailouts, particularly in 2008, did not save anything. This is clear upon analysis of risk models. The Fed and the government are not only to blame for the collapse itself, but also the extremely risky behaviors of entrepreneurs at this time. When you continue to bail out firms that are supposedly too big to fail, other firms seeing this will recognize that should they get into trouble, they will merely be bailed out by the monetary authority, and thus begin engaging in risky, high-return investment. This, along with the holding down of interest rates, prop up companies that should, by all right, be on the verge of collapse or failing on the free market, and thus encourages only more loss to the well-being of the common man in favor of their croniest partners in crime at Wall Street. Markets, should they be allowed to work, will allow for the reallocation of the various factors of production back into intermediary stages for new capital purchases and repairs by higher and lower order stages as per the Ricardo effect and relative prices, as consumers begin to reassert their underlying preferences on the market by dissipating the excess demand for money. By moving the price level upward begins to move the market towards equilibriums of saving, investment, and the demand for money in relation to its supply. Government bailouts never saved capitalism. It only made crises in the future inevitable. Hakim then goes on to, quite obviously with no understanding of the Cantillon effect, talk about wealth inequality. It should be clear at this point that Hakim's understanding of economics is hysterically bad, and that he understands nothing of which he is trying to critique. But this does not sufficiently dispel his points. Anyone in reality who understands the workings of markets would be quite rightly laughing along with me at this joke of a video. But unfortunately, for the sake of humanity, there genuinely exist people who think these are good points, and thus we must seriously engage with these. The myth that vast wealth inequality is a fault of the market is completely untrue. And in fact, the wealth inequality caused today can be pinned to two main factors. Number 1, the central bank's disregarding of the Cantillon effect. Number 2, effective tax rates. The important thing to note here is that neither of these things are naturally occurring phenomena, and are in fact faults of the steps we have made away from capitalism and to socialism. The Cantillon effect describes the situation in which central banks, through existing financial institutions, particularly credit markets or the loanable fund markets, inject new credit into the system by creating more liquidity into banks by tampering with the IOER rate, or the rate at which banks are paid to hold excess reserves, and by open market asset purchases, which is overseen by the FOMC, Federal Open Market Committee. In creating this new credit as inside money, consumers begin to spend this new money. However, money is not neutral to relative prices, and prices are sticky. Some are more sticky than others and thus do not move at equal proportional rates. As consumers push prices upward, they gain at the expense of late receivers, and thus, as most loans take the form of business loans for investment due to interest rates being held down, investors and corporations often benefit from this new money before anyone else. Because of this, people on rigged contracts, say, for example, pensions, wage laborers because of minimum wage, union-backed workers, etc., will see prices rise while their income stagnates. This is even further exemplified by the increasing government debt that causes events in both purchasing power and foreign exchange, like the Plaza Accord, to occur. I need not delve too much into effective tax rates. It should suffice to say that progressive tax rates in reality only further exacerbate wealth inequality. The next ridiculous point that Hakim goes on to make is that models and textbooks do not accurately reflect the wider economy. He is, in general, correct, and yet he still somehow manages to come up with the stupidest reason possible. He infers that textbook models do not take account of the market economy. For the most part, is compromised by consumer spending and interactions with business, yet this is mere nonsense, and shows he's never read an economics textbook. Ever since the Keynesian revolution, economics has been demand-driven. The most pertinent example of this is the reliance on national income accounting that is derived from Keynes' law. What is primarily taught in economics textbooks is what's called the circular flow model, which most certainly emphasizes consumer spending and market relations. The issue is not as Hakim would have you believe, but rather the issue is national income accounting is one of the demand emphasis. When taking into account gross output over the various stages of production, the economy is primarily made up and not driven by consumer spending, but rather B2B transactions, savings, and investment. While short-term demand can temporarily boost economic activity, it cannot create wealth. Only by producing new goods and services can wealth be created. Further, the claim that price signals serve no real function for consumer well-being is demonstrably false in nearly all cases. Prices are a reflection of underlying tacit preferences of individuals placed within a wide vertical and horizontal division of labor and of knowledge. The only way in which this information can be placed in an entrepreneur's immediate zone of relevance to make economic decisions is by condensing this information into one common denominator that can be relatively compared. Entrepreneurs may not know why the price is falling, but they still know that the price is falling and must thereby respond appropriately. Such monetary systems guide the decision-making process that in the absence of these must exist a bout of uncoordinated and incomprehensive plans that, given the reliance on various firms for the production of inputs necessary among the entire wealth creation process, to be used in conjunction with inputs created by other firms, and then outputs of that stage to be used in even further stages in conjunction with the same productive process, must inevitably collapse and be reduced to mere isolationist and bartering levels of production. The socialists and their lackeys merely want to bring us back to a time where extreme poverty permeated everywhere, and people could not live beyond 30 years old.
Chapter 3. Planning under capitalism. Why yes, planning, as expansive, if not even more expansive, than ever occurred under the USSR takes place every single day in practically every firm under capitalism. Of course, in between firms, companies operate on a market, but internally there is no market. Strange, as the market purists want you, and imperial perfect countries they extend criminal loans to believe that markets are the solution to everything, at every time, everywhere.
The central error here and within the book The Republic of Walmart is that they use two fundamentally different terms synonymously, economic planning and planned economy, and views both as incompatible with the market. But one of them is not only compatible with market interactions, but is one of their foundational tools. Economic planning. In order to make a clear distinction between the two phrases, they need to be defined first. Simply put, economic planning is the process by which the various participants in the economy make calculations about the economic steps they must take in the future. In contrast, a planned economy is an entirely centralized system in which the allocation of everything from raw materials to capital goods to consumer goods is implemented by a central authority without the market mechanism. Now, for a full in-depth refutation, I suggest checking out the essay Planned Economy and Economic Planning, What the People's Republic of Walmart Got Wrong About the Nature of Economic Planning by Martin Konya.
Historically, planning was practiced in several countries. First and foremost amongst these is the USSR, the country that began as a backward land of peasants, devoid of industrial production, that within 3 decades became a modern nuclear superpower that conquered the cosmos.
I'm not going to go too in depth in this section because I've already made several other videos talking about the Soviet Union, which I suggest you check out. But yes, the Soviet Union had immense problems with economic calculation. As pointed out in the book Collapse of an Empire, which was written by a Soviet economist, the use of raw materials and energy in the production of each final product was respectively 1.6 and 2.1 times greater than in the United States. The average construction time for an industrial plant in the USSR was more than 10 years. In the United States, it was 2 years. In manufacturing per unit, the USSR in 1980 used 1.8 times more steel than in the United States, 2.3 times more cement, 7.6 times more mineral fertilizer, and 1.5 times more timber. The USSR produced 16 times as many grain harvesters, but harvested less grain and became dependent on grain imports. It's also worth noting that the USSR did incorporate prices, although this was not sufficient enough. Now, Hakim and others try to blame the inefficiencies on the United States and other countries, things like sanctions and oppression. But we can clearly see this is not the full case by looking at the small private sectors in the Soviet Union. The private agriculture sector made up a little over 3% of the USSR's total sown land. Yet it accounted for 43% of vegetable production, 40% of its meat, 39% of its milk, and 66% of its egg production. So we can see that the very small private sector that the Soviet Union allowed was its biggest strength.
It's not all doom and gloom for historic planning, though. In the early 90s, Morel, not a socialist by any regard, published an article in the Journal of Economic Perspectives reviewing empirical studies of efficiency in the socialist planned economies. The results? Virtually all of them found that by standard neoclassical measures of efficiency, the planned economies performed as well or better than market economies. Of the 18 studies he reviewed concerning technical efficiency of firms and standardizing their methodologies, he got the following results. A 90% level of technical efficiency in capitalist firms, a level of 93% in Soviet firms, in another 84% versus 86%, in another 87% versus 95%, and so on, practically identical. Furthermore, to the disappointment of those that decry the supposed soft budget constraints of socialist economies, meaning since the socialist state had an interest in having firms succeed, those same firms have technically no hard budget limit, and somehow this leads to inefficiencies. The reality is that socialist economies had a pretty high level of allocative efficiency, which is the degree to which inputs are allocated among firms in a way that maximizes the total output. His research found that, even at 100% allocative efficiency of inputs, Soviet outputs would grow only by a meager 2%. Hilariously, in my research for this video, I found strange justifications for these sort of results from the pro-market side. Basically, oh yeah, Soviet planned economy was as efficient, if not more efficient at allocating resources, but that's because they didn't have technological innovation. Only the market can do that. Rarely do I see such concentrated cope.
This might be by far the most dishonest part of Hakim's video, because that pro-market side he's talking about here, to which his only response is cope, those are the very people who wrote the research he is falsely quoting. These economists pointed out that people like Hakim, who fetishize the Soviet Union, reach false conclusions based on their research. Robert Whitesell is one of these researchers. He wrote a paper entitled, "Why Does the Soviet Economy Appear to Be Allocatively Efficient?" And this paper was published under the approval of Morel. The introduction reads, "Despite the conventional wisdom that the Soviet economy is inefficient in every dimension, there's a rather large amount of statistical and econometric evidence that some aspects of the Soviet economy may be allocatively efficient relative to market economies. The conventional wisdom is based on a plethora of institutional analyses, case studies, and statistics that demonstrate poor performance in the Soviet economy. The only exceptions to this dismal assessment of the Soviet economic performance are a number of statistical studies. This paper argues that econometric results showing the Soviet allocative efficiency do not refute the conventional wisdom of poor Soviet economic performance, but in fact are completely consistent with such an evaluation." So Hakim is just further proving he does not understand economics. He is trying to discredit the very economists that he is citing. Efficiency can mean many different things in economics. There's several different types of efficiency. Economic efficiency concerns the ability of an economy to produce what is demanded from it. This is producing the right goods at the right time in the right amount, or producing at the desired point of the appropriate n-dimensional production possibility frontier, or PPF. And we can divide that into static efficiency, how close to the PPF the economy is at any given point in time, dynamic efficiency, how fast the PPF expands. Then we have allocative efficiency. This concerns the ability of an economy to efficiently allocate inputs. An economy is allocatively efficient if given a level of technology. No gains can be made if productive factors are shifted around, or that the marginal rates of technical substitution, or MRTS, for the inputs are equal in every possible use. An economy can be allocatively efficient and yet be inside the PPF due to technical inefficiency. Then we have technical efficiency. This concerns the ability of an economy to produce the output one would expect from its inputs and technological level, relative to some standard with respect to a relevant PPF. Some authors take the level of the PPF to be at the level of the country, others in the level of the industry within the country, and others an international PPF. Then we have total factor productivity, ratio between output and weighted function of inputs, capital and labor. It is not exactly a type of efficiency, and it is used to measure how much growth is not due to variations in inputs, which typically is taken to mean how well the economy is making use of those resources. Sometimes TFP growth is confused for some sort of rate of technological improvement, but it is not. TFP is calculated as a residual, and everything that affects how well an economy converts inputs to outputs will be captured by it. So yes, the Soviet Union did have low allocative efficiency. And again, Hakim is merely being dishonest.
The core of Mises' argument is that prices and costs are the best way to compare between alternative forms of making things, and to arrive at that which is most efficient. Mises seems to miss the possibility of a socialist economy setting internal prices, not as an expression of market value, but as an expression of alternative options in order to move resources between enterprises. With enough data and enough math, you can calculate your way to efficient prices. But even that is unnecessary. The modern argument, which has its roots as early as the 1930s, is to use labor time as an alternative to prices, something Mises himself conceded.
Yeah, citation needed. Citation really needed, because, yeah, he just made that up on the spot. He literally just made it up. Great job, man. I'm trying to cut back on time a little bit, so if you would like to read what Mises said on labor time, I suggest checking out Economic Calculation in the Socialist Commonwealth, pages 29 and 30. The issues with labor time are the non-homogeneity of labor, interpersonal subjective utility, and the actual application of the labor theory of value to non-reproducible natural resources. There are different qualities of labor, like skilled and unskilled labor. For example, different fields have different jobs and therefore different types of labor. And even within the same field and even in the exact same job, people do not act the same as one another, and because of this, their labor is different. It is not a homogeneous quantity that we can use to assess a particular production process. Now I think at this point I'm pretty much done with his video and we can wrap this up. Like I pointed out in the beginning, Hakim pretends that there are no responses to the arguments he presents, and I've shown clearly here there are many. I quoted from a few wonderful essays, and I will be linking them all in the description. I'll also add a few additional resources that cover some other things he talked about, such as the environment, which I thought was pretty funny for him to bring up considering the Soviet Union was the worst polluter in the history of mankind, and the fall of the Soviet Union was the biggest reversal of pollution in the history of mankind. Great going there, socialists. I also would like to thank the people who helped me with this video, those from volunteers Taven such as Craig Duddy. Also, Spectrify, Mustafa, Ashton, and Eric, who wrote a great essay that talks about the economic calculation problem and the proposed solutions to it. Also, if Hakim is watching this, I would love to propose a debate with you. We can talk about the economic calculation problem, and you can present your solutions, and we can have a discussion in real time. If you'd like to do this, then just let me know. Anyways, thank you guys for watching, and I will see you next time.